for fine career as a professional musician for London Philharmonic, if I'm not mistaken, said, hey, this is important stuff. I'm going to look at this. And he did, and made another career completely, writing extremely important books, going back a number of years. Most of you have read some of these books. Timothy's carved out a niche as someone with class and style and literacy, able to speak a very high level about this to any group, whether it's a basic conference of interested public or whether it's a group of individuals working for the government or scientists or anybody else. The very fact that someone of this quality is pursuing this issue for years should in of itself be enough to convince every editor of every significant newspaper in England, UK rather, and the United States that this issue must be engaged. You know, win the Pulitzer Prizes, suffer that, whatever, engage the issue. Stop dodging it, stop playing along with the government. He's not giving up, we're not giving up, and clearly you are not giving up. So for that, let's give a tremendous hand of applause to a gentleman who's come a very long way. Timothy, good.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that welcome. Greetings from London. I think it'll have to come up a whole heap higher, but it won't, unfortunately. So, is that better if I crouch like this? Because it, unless they do something with that one. One of my books is entitled Above Top Secret, another Beyond Top Secret. There's no important difference in either. The second book, Beyond Top Secret, contains a considerable amount of new information. But for the benefit of newcomers and maybe members of the press present today who may not be aware of the facts, I should perhaps explain what above or beyond top secret means. It's not an official classification per se. And it might sound like a contradiction in terms, like military intelligence or European Union. I'm sure you can think of many others. What it means is that a great deal of information is top secret. Thousands of people have top secret clearance all over the world, in various governments. But when things get really sensitive, you need an additional compartment, which is usually described through a code word. And I'm going to show you one shortly. Stanton Friedman will be speaking at length about this, I'm sure. Some of the National Security Agency documents, a 21-page above top secret affidavit, giving their reasons why the NSA is restricting information on UFOs. And there it is, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, I have spoken to someone who's seen this 21-page above top secret affidavit. It doesn't have anything about pickled aliens or secret contacts with aliens, nothing like that. It's basically methods and sources, which the agency does not want divulged. You know, how many foreign embassies they bugged for information about UFOs and so forth. I'm sorry, well, can you turn the sound up, or is that better? Well, I just have to crouch down here. Is that better? Can you turn up the sound, maybe? Will that help? Okay, I'll try. Except there's two of them glued together. All right? How's that? Stereo. Now, I'm always asked how I got interested in the subject. It was after reading a book by Major Donald Kehoe describing sightings by highly qualified observers such as military and civilian pilots. And being an aviation buff myself, this is back in 1955, passionate about aviation and space travel, I became hooked on UFOs. Major Kehoe was the first to expose a cover-up at high levels within the Pentagon. And he had very good contacts in Air Force intelligence, CIA, and so forth. Of course, he was discredited, but he was the first, really, to expose the cover-up. A highly credible man, an aide to Lindbergh, pilot, Marine Corps, Annapolis graduate. But the United States intelligence community is, of course, quite varied and enormous. This is about 10 years out of date. But it does show most of the official intelligence agencies. And for those who may not be aware, since the Freedom of Information Act, tens of thousands of documents have now been released under provisions of the FOIA from agencies which hitherto denied holding such documents or having any interest in the subject. Now, my friend and compatriot Nick Pope will be speaking later today about the British government's involvement in UFOs, but I just want to give you one teaser here, a document dating back to 1942, a report by a Lancaster crew, bomber crew of an extraordinary sighting, and another report on the same secret document describing another report by the same commander of that Lancaster bomber. Here's a picture of a Lancaster. Maybe we can you see the slides clearly, or are they blind whited out? Can we do something like that? Anyway, I suppose the best equivalent during World War II would be the B-17 bomber. But you can hear more about that from Nick later on. This is a P-47 Thunderbolt plane. Now, I know many of you are not too happy with the French for not joining in the coalition regarding Iraq. But let me tell you that in 1945, a French Air Force pilot, as a training instructor at Selfridge Airfield in Michigan, became the first pilot to attack a UFO and save the United States continent from alien invasion. True story. I spoke to the guy. I met him in Paris a few years ago. There was a mass of sightings of what were called balloons at that time in the area around Selfridge. And one day, some of these things were seen over the base. And this fighter pilot was sent up to intercept it. And he got to one of these things within close range. You could see it hovering there. And he let rip with his machine guns. What happened? The balloon suddenly darted sideways at phenomenal speed, at right angles. And that was no balloon, he told me. He also said that a few weeks later, thank you, we learned at the base that a fighter had crashed near Denver after firing at a UFO. In 1952, this pilot was a first officer on an Air France plane, and there were 20 or 30 US military officers on board, as well as some civilians. This was a VIP flight, he told me. One told me that there was a UFO specialist unit at the Pentagon, a very important unit, which dealt exclusively with the UFO phenomenon. And the reasons for the cover-up at that time, as given to him, were basically fear of panic. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 1945 alleged retrieval of a UFO in San Antonio, not San Antonio, Texas, but San Antonio, New Mexico, in August of 1945. Two witnesses have come forward, Remy Barker and Jose Padilla, who claim as boys that they saw this craft, They had a good look at it. They went and told their father. He called the police. Later on, the police told the army came in and recovered it, and the boys were able to watch the recovery operation from a vantage point. And they saw this thing eventually being loaded on a flatbed truck through their father's ranch at that time, the Padilla Ranch. It's a very interesting story. It was published last year in a local newspaper, and it's also appeared in the now defunct British UFO magazine, and I'm sure it'll appear shortly in MUFON Journal, if it hasn't already, in the latest issue. But I've spoken to one of those witnesses, and I must say I find him highly credible. I just want to touch briefly on Roswell again for the benefit of newcomers and members of the press who may not realize, for example, that many military officers have signed sworn affidavits testifying to various events in and around New Mexico, Roswell area in July of 1947. And here's one by General Dubose, who admits that there was indeed a cover-up. And he said in another interview that General Clements McMullen, Deputy Commander of Strategic Air Command, was responsible for ordering the cover-up. And he said, look, you know, we'd just been through a world war. We'd seen the firebombing of great cities, explosion of atom bombs on Japan, destruction on an unprecedented scale. Then came this flying saucer business. It was simply too much for the public to have to deal with. Those were the reasons given back in 1947, and I myself think they're perfectly valid. In Beyond Top Secret, I published the testimony of a Polish biophysicist, one of a team, an international but small and select team of physicists, biophysicists sent to analyze some materials in the United States on two occasions, in 1974 and 1977. 1974, they handled bizarre metallic and other materials. In 1977, at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, they were shown the alleged remains of alien bodies. And the caption said, from the first and second incidents in New Mexico. As to locations, these were not given. But this biophysicist has relayed considerable amount of information. He learned a great deal from this experience of seeing these things in a vault at JPL, together with the other scientists. A report from 1948. I beg your pardon?
We can't hear you.
Still. Can you turn the sound up? I'm sorry, I can't speak any louder. I can't get any closer to the microphone. Is it that? Ah. Here we go. Right. A top secret 1948 United States Air Force Europe report makes some interesting statements about a craft. And I'm most interested in some of the later comment here that an object crashed or landed in the lake, and intelligence was sufficiently confident in the observation that a naval salvage team was sent to the lake. Operations were underway and so forth, discovered a previously uncharted crater, no further information available, but we've been promised knowledge of the results. Reliable information and so on and so forth. Now, Nick Pope is going to be dealing with this, the history of the British government's involvement in UFO research, in his presentation this afternoon, but I just wanted to show you a couple of pages from a top secret document relating to the Flying Saucer Working Party, established in 1950 under Prime Minister Clement Attlee. That's all right, it's a blank one. Now, this working party established a network of investigators on the result of cooperation with the United States, who had been in touch with their British intelligence counterparts. And numerous cases were looked at, including some really sensational ones, such as in August 1950, when test pilots on several occasions saw UFO, on one occasion at close quarters, pass right over the Farnborough airfield, where these test pilots were based. And the official interpretation of this, when the Flying Saucer Working Party spoke to these people, was that they'd just seen an ordinary airplane. You know, these are test pilots. You know, a great huge humming disc, electrostatic discharge, and so forth. This was just an ordinary airplane. The CIA report, 1952, alluding to the British Flying Saucer Working Group. The British have had a standing committee created about 16 months ago. Interesting, it doesn't mention that it was officially cancelled in 1951. Maybe it was continued in some other form. We don't know. This is Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley, who was Deputy Chief of Strike Command in the 1950s and was an equerry, that's a military attaché to Prince Philip and the Queen at Buckingham Palace for 7 years. He was a war hero, flown 90 different types of aircraft. He had extensive contacts with United States intelligence officials. He had obviously top secret clearances to do with nuclear-related material, since he had his finger on the nuclear trigger. One thing he was unable to access was the American intelligence people's information on UFOs. They just told him that was a no-no. On everything else, we had good cooperation, but not that. Interestingly, in 1954, and I'll be talking more about this tomorrow, Sir Peter claims to have had a 2-hour meeting with an extraterrestrial human being in the middle of London, arranged via a British Army general. That is an extraordinary story. I've published it in my book, Alien Base. And as I say, I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. Being an aviation buff makes me intrigued by reports by qualified pilots, and there have been thousands of them. According to Dr. Richard Haynes, there's been about 3,400 plus since 1920, and many more go unreported. This is the mighty B-36 bomber, and there were several sightings by the crews of those aircraft, and this one involved a 100-foot disc over South Dakota, 1956, 100-foot diameter. I don't know how many of you may have heard of the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, but in 1998, in May 1998, I was invited to that office in the Pentagon by Major General Kenneth Israel, who was the then director. At that time, the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, or DARO, handled the unmanned spy planes, or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. And I was there to listen to what he and his team of military officers there had to say and what I had to say. They didn't discuss the subject per se of UFOs, but I did. I was invited to address the assembled gathering. I did so very briefly. And later on, in front of the assembled gathering, Kenneth Israel looked at some of the evidence I had, which included the very controversial movie film taken in 1965 here in Maryland, in Silver Spring, Maryland, by the notorious George Adamski, together with Madeline Rodefer and 3 other witnesses. If you can't read it, it says, hey, look, it's a 1950 Adamski Mark I scout ship. Yeah, you don't see many of them around anymore. And here's a frame from that 8mm film, which had been analyzed at Kodak. Adamski was taken to the Kodak laboratory with Bill Sherwood, a senior project development engineer and optical physicist at Kodak at that time, and he concludes that it's absolutely genuine. The Kodak people couldn't see how this film, with a particular movement of the craft, could be duplicated using 8mm film. The craft distorts, apparently related to a very powerful gravitational field which distorts light rays. And there's Madeline Rodefer. She's still going strong at 81. And this was a picture I took just a few years after that film was taken in Silver Spring. Unidentified submarine objects continue to interest me. Here's a case reported by the US Coast Guard in 1973 relating to an object which was seen by some fishermen in the Pascagoula, Mississippi area. And it was, they called the Coast Guards, they turned up, and they saw the thing too. And at one stage, these guys actually managed to touch this very solid, illuminated undersea object with one of the oars on the boat. I know many of you are familiar with the Tehran case of September 1976, but I just wanted to mention something else in addition to this. This is part of a secret Air Force intelligence report. 2 Phantom jets were sent up to pursue an invader over Tehran. And at one stage, a second object detached itself from the UFO, as you can see, and headed straight for the Phantom. Pilots attempted to fire an AIM-9 missile, but was prevented by a sudden power loss. There was communications problems, all sorts of problems. And subsequently, it's been learned that at one stage, the pilots, or one of the pilots, tried to eject, but the ejection system malfunctioned, as well as the weapons control panel, as well as communications and everything else. So they stayed with the aircraft. There's been a great deal of interest in the former Soviet Union in this subject, and this is Yuri Andropov, who was not only head of the KGB, but for a short while he was president of the Soviet Union as well. And this is what it says, and it's been substantiated by other military men in the former Soviet Union, that in the 1970s, following an extraordinary event, UFO watch stations were established using as many as 4 million potential witnesses ordered to look for UFOs. And this was also with the cooperation of the Soviet Defense Ministry and the Soviet Academy of Sciences. This is Rubens Vilela, a Brazilian scientist, meteorologist, who was also a CIA communications specialist. And he's been to the Antarctic on many occasions, mostly with the United States Navy as a meteorologist. He had a fantastic sighting there together with US Navy officers. And eventually, he established communications with ETs, so he claims. And I'll be talking about that in some detail tomorrow. For the benefit of you who think he might be a crank, I can assure you he's not. This is an article in the Portuguese edition of Scientific American late last year. Brazil, also 1977, a team of intelligence officers headed by Lieutenant Colonel Hollander was sent to northeast Brazil to investigate some very disturbing cases of UFOs where people had been struck by beams of light. Well, the entire team of intelligence experts themselves had encounters with various types of craft. Their eyesight suffered, sometimes permanently, from close encounters with these craft. And Hollander was asked, you know, the Brazilian Air Force and the Brazilian government get asked 3 questions, you know, where are they coming from, what do they want, and so forth. And we just don't have the answers to these questions, he says. Only the United States government is sufficiently advanced in this area. Brazil, one of 2 alien creatures supposedly recovered in Varginha in January of 1996. It's a long, detailed case, but it's extraordinary in that so many military people involved and medical people involved in one of the autopsies have come forward and allowed their names to be used. One of the military people involved in the recovery or capture of one of these aliens died shortly afterwards from some ill effects from some materials on the creature's body. The official explanation, this is Major Kalza, one of the representatives at the nearby army base, said that it's quite simple to explain. There are a number of dwarves in Varginha, and some of them were taking cover from the rain at the time, and there was a pregnant dwarf couple, or at least one of them was pregnant, and that was the explanation for the sightings. The Americans got the bodies, by the way. Give her time. So this is how the press tends to react, the tabloids at least. Disturbing cases of missing aircraft and pilots are, I'm convinced, one of the reasons for the cover-up. This is quite serious. It's quite possible that several hundred, as many as several hundred pilots and planes have disappeared. And this was a case in the southern apex of the so-called Bermuda Triangle in the Puerto Rico area. I've spent a lot of time there. This was in 1980. Two young pilots flying this air coupe from the Dominican Republic to San Juan, Puerto Rico, suddenly reported a strange object in front of them. And here is the official National Transportation Board report, or at least part of it, referring to the Mayday on the emergency frequency and the report there. We found a weird object in our course that made us change course about 3 different times. We got it right now in front of us, and so forth. And that was the last that was ever heard from those pilots, and there was no sign of wreckage or anything. Now, I'm sure that Stephen Greer will be mentioning the Anchorage case of 1986, when the crew of a Japan Airlines cargo jet, jumbo jet, saw a huge UFO. And a new witness has come forward to give more information from the point of the aviation perspective, the information that he was involved in. But this, to give you some idea, this is the captain's drawing of the craft. There it is. And there's the jumbo jet for comparison. China. This is a Defense Intelligence Agency report from one of the attaches based on open sources, that's like newspapers and magazines, about UFOs in China. And of course, there's tremendous interest in that country. Here's a case from 1987 when a Chinese Air Force jet chased a disc in full view of hundreds of witnesses, apparently, over Shanghai. And the Communist Party attends UFO meetings. You cannot become an official UFO researcher in China unless you have a PhD, published peer-reviewed papers on your particular discipline and so forth. So they take it very seriously. The attitude seems to be quite different from that in the West. Belgium, 1990, photograph of one of the famous flying triangles. Well, of course, they were seen all over Europe around that time. And Colonel Wilfried de Brouwer, whom I spoke to, has confirmed that there was no terrestrial explanation for these things. I don't know if any of you have seen this as part of his official report. He discounts aircraft, including stealth, and so forth. Well, we've had triangles all over. Here's one from the former Soviet Union in Samara in 1990 at a radar station seen by numerous military personnel, some of whom suffered missing time, apparently, at the site during this encounter. In France, they have an official UFO investigative agency called SEPRA, that's the acronym. And here's one of the cases reported to them. This was just a bit from the Times newspaper in London. Huge 300-meter-long object over the Paris area, seen by a pilot. I'm sorry, I have to move on because time is short, but there are so many of these cases which get reported quite sensibly in the broadsheets, amazingly, from time to time. And here's one, January 1995, when British Airways Boeing 737 on its final approach was buzzed by a wedge-shaped object which caused the pilots to duck, as you can see in this picture. It was not any conventional object, nor, in my opinion, was it a secret test vehicle. You don't test prototype secret aircraft on the final approach to an international airport. British pilot, American World War II co-pilot, in the 1990s flying a Cessna Skymaster transcontinental right across the States. They got to the Mojave Desert when suddenly something shot towards them on a collision course. They ducked, just like those British Airways flyers before, and this thing shot past them. And then they had a feeling that there was something to the side. They looked, and there was this, and the captain took a photograph, and there was what showed over the Mojave Desert. And later on, they took the film to the Navy and asked them what they thought it was, and the answer came back, no comment. Take us to your leader. This is the Conservative Party leader in the United Kingdom, Michael Howard. When he was Home Secretary of the then in-power Conservative Party in 1997, there was a sighting of a large triangular object right over his house in a remote area of Kent. There were several witnesses. This was one of the a journalist who saw it, and her drawing, and an extraordinary case, which of course has been officially denied. France, in Paris, the War College, military college, and about 5 years ago, an extraordinary group calling itself Cometa, consisting of retired auditors and military personnel from the Institute of Higher Studies for National Defense. There's their emblem. I've met some of these people. Many of them did not allow their names to be used, mostly for fear of ridicule in the French media, actually. But here are just some of them, including a 5-star general. And they concluded, in their opinion, an extraordinary document they published, 1999, that the most likely reason for the uniquely high level of secrecy attached to the subject by the United States government is that we have acquired some technology and possibly an exclusive contact with ETs. That's coming from a group of retired military people. And in June of 2002, I was invited to the French Air Force headquarters in Paris for private discussions, and it was quite illuminating. These guys take it seriously, though interestingly, they keep saying, you know, one of the reasons that we keep quiet about it is just the merciless ridicule that the subject attracts in the French media. That plane didn't make a low-flying pass to greet me, by the way. In Turkey, August of 2001, there was a dogfight with a UFO reported by a trainer and his trainee pilot, and in a Cessna T-37 rather. It created a lot of interest. There's been a lot of things happening in Turkey. Larry Bryant of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy has been really giving the CIA a hard time because they asked last year for all MIT, that's the Turkish equivalent of CIA, all the MIT's UFO reports. And if you want more information, talk to Larry Bryant or Esen Şekerkara from Turkey, who is here, who has studied these cases. There's a T-37. Incidentally, the CIA has denies any sort of release of any information, neither confirming nor denying, and so on and so forth. Gorbachev, in 1987, referring to the Geneva summit 2 years earlier, says that the United States president discussed with me the possibility of an extraterrestrial invasion, and that in this event, our nations would collaborate. And around the same time, 1987, President Reagan announced, as you all know, towards the end of a very important speech before the United Nations General Assembly, that, you know, our differences how he often thought how our differences worldwide would quickly vanish if we were faced by some extraterrestrial threat. And then he went on to say, but, you know, I ask, is not an alien force already among us? It could have been rhetorical. He went on to sort of qualify it in a very vague way, but I think he was trying to tell us something because he had a deep interest in the subject, as has been reported, ever since he had a sighting. He had two sightings, actually, one of which was as governor of California in his plane, in the governor's plane. So, in my last book, Unearthly Disclosure, in the last chapter, I detail the extraordinary revelations, disinformation, call it what you will, which came to me via one of my sources in Washington, a highly respected journalist in the aerospace field. And over a period of several years, he was given information by a source who was attached to the US Air Force Air Staff and the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. Can someone just return the projector? Thank you very much indeed. And a great deal of information was given, some of it incredible. I've detailed it. Aliens have been coming here for a very long time. There's not much we can do about it. It's not just one species. Some of them are good guys, others not so. Some have our best interests at heart, others most certainly do not. There seems to be a vested interest in this planet on the part of some of them. They've been coming here for a very long time. They have established bases here, undersea bases and underground bases in various continents. Tomorrow I shall be going into specific alleged locations. There has been new technology which has been passed to us, including new knowledge pertaining to plasma physics. Plasma physics is the key, I was told. Great deal of information. Very few people in the intelligence community are aware of all this. It is definitely the most sensitive subject within the intelligence community in the United States, at least. There's information about what some of these guys are doing. Some of them are messing around with the tectonic plates in the Pacific, which was causing considerable concern at a high level in the Pentagon, as you might well imagine. There's all sorts of detail. It's possible that quite a bit of it is disinformation, which is par for the course when, you know, government or military officials are passing information to journalists. But in my opinion, I think quite a bit of the stuff is basically true. Well, it's time to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just conclude on one note. Whatever threat is posed to this planet by extraterrestrial species, we have a great deal more to fear from our own beings. Thank you very much indeed.